Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here with us again today. Welcome to another Zoom presentation, Aruba Post Corona, the new normal. As you know, this is a series of Zoom presentations that we will be organizing throughout the month of May and June. And at the end of every presentation, there would be a moment for Q&A. This series of Zoom is hosted by the Center for Lifelong Learning here at the University of Aruba. And for those who don't know me as yet, my name is Deborah van den Berg Alexander, and I am the coordinator for the Center for Lifelong Learning here at the University of Aruba. So as you were waiting in the waiting room, you would have seen there were some rules that I had put up, which is keep your microphones on mute. For the end, as the Q&A, as I said, you can please provide your questions via the chat box. It would be nice at the end if, and during the presentation, if you keep the speaker on speaker view, and I would like to ask you to have patience with the internet because it's something we're all having some difficulties with, be it at home or in our workplace these days. So today's topic number 3 from the series, as I mentioned, is how will Aruba's tourism recover in the short term? I think it's a very interesting topic and one that is really current here in Aruba because, as we all know, our economy depends largely on tourism. And we have no one else other than Dr. James, call him Jim, Happel, as our guest lecturer. Now, I think for many of you, James is no unknown person, unknown figure, very charismatic person, as I've learned him through the past years. He is a lecturer here at the University of Aruba, so therefore, you know, a dear colleague. He's also author of the recent paper, When Will Aruba's Tourism Industry Recover? It's a paper that we've seen used many places lately. He also served as president and CEO of the Aruba Hotel and Tourism Association, IATA, and this was from the period from 2009 until 2018. Now, finally, before we go on to Jim's presentation, he coordinates and teaches in the MBA program at the Faculty of Hospitality and Tourism Management Studies. So without further ado, Jim, I would like for you to take this presentation over and blow us away.
Thank you, Deborah, and good morning, everyone. Bon dia. Very much appreciate this opportunity to talk with you today. The presentation takes about 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. And I thank you for your participation again today. Well, very quickly, we're talking about what I think the picture of Aruba's tourism is going to be in the short term. I think using the word recover at this stage, it's going to take a while for recovery. It's going to take quite a long time. But what we're talking about today is really within the next 7 months or so until the end of the year. So just by way of background, we know Aruba has an official population of about 112,000 persons, although we know that there are in fact more than that living on the island. It has a workforce of about 58,000 persons and about 38,500 households with an average of about 2.9 persons per household. But this is what we're really talking about in terms of who's been impacted by this particular crisis. Those are people who stay for 24 hours or more, using all kinds of different accommodation, and 832,000 cruise visitors. Now, by comparing the two different segments, stopover visitors typically stay just over 7 nights on average when they're here in Aruba, while the cruise ships on average spend about 10 hours here in Aruba. Tourism generated an estimated 3.7 billion in tourism credits, and consequently stopover visitors generated about 95% of all of that spending. Tourism credits are basically tourism receipts plus timeshare maintenance fees. So 3.56 billion florins generated by stopovers, while cruise visitors They stay for a much shorter period of time. Their economic impact is much less. About 180 million florins, about 5% of all credit. So if we're going to grow the tourism economy again, our clear focus is going to be on stopover visitors because of their much more significant economic impact. Now, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, tourism contributed about 74% last year to the gross domestic product of Aruba. That's 3 out of every 4 florins comes from tourism. And tourism spending supported directly and indirectly 84% of all employment. About 17 out of every 20 workers are working as a result of tourist spending. And it's one of the most tourism-dependent countries in the world. Also in 2019, 75% of Aruba's visitors came from the United States, with 4% coming from Canada and 4% from the Netherlands, with the balance coming from the rest of the world. So very heavily dependent, almost 80% on North America. Of those Americans, 52% came from the 5 northeastern states of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. And New York State was by far the most important state in terms of generating visitors from the United States. 20% of all visitors came from the United States. Now, we're all aware of what basically has happened over the past 6 months. The COVID-19 virus began to spread from the Far East in late December and into January. And in February and March, many countries in the world began to close down their borders to international travel in an effort to prevent the further spread of the virus. By April the 20th, the United Nations World Tourism Organization noted that 217 countries worldwide, that's almost all of the countries in the world, had put some form of travel restriction in place, prohibiting or restricting international travel. 45% had totally or partially closed their borders for tourists. Passengers were not allowed to enter. A further 30% had suspended totally or partially international flights. 18% had banned the entry of passengers from specific countries of origin. You'll remember that in the early days, travel was prevented from China to the United States, or from Europe to the United States. This is before there became global restrictions. And 7% have applied different kinds of measures, such as a requirement for a visitor to go into quarantine or self-isolation for 14 days, or some kind of restriction on the visa. Deborah? Thanks. The situation in Aruba is very similar. On March the 15th, regulations were put in place regulating the entry of visitors to Aruba. And on March the 21st, the border was closed indefinitely to incoming visitors and returning residents. And on that same date, a curfew from 9 until 6 was implemented, both in an attempt to slow down this spread of infection. 8 days later, on March the 29th, a shelter-in-place order was implemented whereby the population was confined to their homes except for essential purposes. And that was lifted as of yesterday because the number of reported cases, as we all know, has basically plateaued, which is good news. And so the restrictions are beginning to get limited. Now, as a result of those restrictions, the United Nations World Tourism Organization has projected that 2020 is going to see a huge drop in international travel, anywhere from 60 to 80%. Now what they've done is they've developed 3 different scenarios, and you can see the blue and the green and the amber. Basically what they're saying is that scenario 1, which is their optimistic scenario, is that nations worldwide begin to open up their borders in July, and the rate of decline of travel compared to 2019 begins to improve, and by the end of the year, the decline should be about 60%. Scenario 2 is that those borders don't really become fully open until September, and the rate of decline compared to 2019 would be a 70% drop. And scenario 3 is a worst case scenario, that the borders really don't become fully open until the end of the year, and that would see a close to 80% decline in international travel. The International Air Travel Association, IATA, has put forward similar projections for 2020. You can see the red line is international travel, the blue line is domestic flights, domestic passengers, and you can see what they're saying is that for 2020, international travel will be down about 55%. In 21, it'll be down 30% compared to 2019. The column on the left is an index with 100 being 2019. And you can see that international travel won't recover until 2023, 24, by that being the same level as it was in 2019. Now, of course, these scenarios are all subject to change and evolution as circumstances change, but there is a consistency that 2020 is going to see a very, very substantial drop in international travel. As a result of the projections that have been put forward, UNWTO, IATA, and others, together with a survey that the Aruba Hotel and Tourism Association did of its own hotel members, IATA is projecting that hotel room occupancy won't reach an average of 55% for the island until December of this year in 2020. And you can see how they were projecting that in July it could be 30% and then growing slowly in August, September, October, until reaching 55% by December. Now, if those numbers hold, then we'll be looking at about a 60 to 65% fewer hotel visitors in 2020 compared to 2019. Now, Deborah referred to a paper I prepared a few weeks ago, and basically what I did was I looked at scenarios for Aruba for 2020. There were 3 scenarios: optimistic, likely, pessimistic. With the scenario optimistic, obviously best case scenario, likely, probably a base case, and then this scenario, the worst possible outcome being the pessimistic. Now, it's important to note that with all scenarios, they all reflect an opinion. It's based on assumptions, assessments, and currently available data, which are all constantly changing and evolving. So as the situation evolves, then obviously these scenarios will be reevaluated and modified. But basically, Deborah, what seems to be the likely situation is that 2020 is going to see the number of stopovers to Aruba fall by about 60% and cruise visitors falling by 46%. The cruise one is very variable because no one's quite sure exactly where the cruises are going to come from, what their ports of call are going to be. The Cayman Islands is looking very strongly at preventing cruise visitors coming in, certainly until September, possibly until the end of the year. And 2021 could see some recovery with both stopover and cruise arrivals, probably 15, maybe higher, 15% higher than in 2020. Now, obviously, with tourism being so important to the economy and the livelihood of so many people in Aruba, the government wants to reopen the borders between June 15th and July 1. And this is very similar to what's going on in the rest of the Caribbean. St. Lucia's opening on June 4. Punta Cana is talking about June 1. Cancun is talking about June 1. So many destinations in the region, because of the importance of tourism to the various countries, are now looking at a June-July reopening of the borders. But in every instance, this is going to demand that the tourism sector implements all kinds of very, very detailed and comprehensive health and safety protocols. Here in Aruba, the ATA, together with the Department of Health, is putting in place a Clean Seal certification program, which declares that businesses who obtain the certificate will get that certificate on the basis of consistently and frequently applying cleaning, sanitation, proper hygiene measures to ensure the health of safety, not just for visitors, but obviously for locals as well. However, just because we're opening up the borders doesn't mean that the visitors are going to come. Obviously, tourism is 10% of the world's economy, and so there's a tremendous amount of interest in terms of when is the industry going to start reopening and bringing back visitors and income. And many surveys have been done, particularly in the United States, and in Europe as to the intention of potential visitors. And basically the overall conclusion seems to be, particularly in the United States, can you go back? Thanks. That basically it's going to be staycations first, a staycation being very close to home, probably 2 or 3 days away, and then maybe a regional trip, say within state, by car. And that's going to be very important. There's a very strong reluctance to get on a plane or for any form of mass transportation. So private car, regional staycations first. Then trips within their country, and that's going to be for 2 reasons. One, there's going to be a general reluctance to travel internationally because of all of the constraints. But secondly, each country is going to want to rebuild its own domestic tourism industry, and they will encourage their own residents to stay within their country. New Zealand is doing this. Australia is thinking of banning all international travel for its residents until 2021. So it could be an economic policy that you have to take a trip within your own country. And then finally, international trips. As a result, the Aruba Tourism Authority and the Airport Authority are projecting visitor levels at between 1,000 to 2,000 persons a week, which is about 4,000 to 8,000 visitors a month. And that's about 5 to 10% of the total visitors received during the same months of 2019. So instead of 100 visitors, we'd be getting 10. And so consequently, obviously, the economic impact is going to be quite significant. Now, no one can say for how long these numbers will be valid, in the sense that clearly as the situation improves, the numbers should grow. But this is a starting point. Now, Aruba is obviously going to continue to target the US market, and that's for various reasons. Firstly, timeshare customers and timeshare visitors make up about 27% of our visitors. Most of our timeshare customers are from the United States. Most of our large hotel brands are major US brands, and their loyalty programs, which are very important in terms of generating business, their loyalty program customers are mostly Americans. Most of our airlift comes from the United States, and most of our repeat customers live in the United States. So clearly we're going to continue to focus on the United States. But merely because we're opening the borders doesn't mean that demand is automatically going to grow. These decisions are not in our hands. We're going to be held hostage to the protocols put in place in the United States as to how they deal with returning residents. And this is a big, uncertain matter at the moment. At the moment, US citizens have been advised by their government not to travel abroad. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, on its website requires returning visitors from an international trip to go into self-quarantine on their return for 14 days. That's the official policy at the moment. In addition to that, there could well be a second and third wave of infections in the United States in the fourth quarter of 2020 and early 21, which may well result in a further lockdown and reintroduction of travel restrictions. So, as I say, the decision to open is ours. The decision for people to come is really not in our hands because of a variety of reasons. Now, unfortunately, depending on the US market has certain risks. And this is not a political statement. It's generally accepted that the United States has badly mishandled its response to the pandemic. The United States has 4% of the world's population. It has in excess of 30% of the cases and approaching 30% of the deaths. The infection level in its population continues to grow and may well increase with the opening up of the various state economies. No one's quite sure exactly how that's going to be managed. Now, clearly, to protect Arubans who've made so many sacrifices to be able to bring the infections under control, they're going to have to be stringent controls as to who and who will not be admitted into the country. Various protocols are going to be established as to how you can get onto an international flight at the point of departure in the United States or elsewhere. And then clearly there may well have to be follow-up protocols on arrival to make sure that no one has gotten infected even on the flight. And we're getting some pushback from Europe that European visitors have looked what's been happening in the United States, and they may be reluctant to visit if they feel there are too many Americans in a destination. Now, it could be that there's increasing interest in what has happened in Sweden, and that the Swedish model might be the one to follow. In the absence of a vaccine, which generally speaking, most people think is going to be about 18 to 24 months, because it's not just not just developing the vaccine, it's got to be manufactured, it's got to be distributed, people have got to understand who's going to get it first. All of that is quite complicated. So there is this thing called herd immunity, whereby 50 to 60% of the population has been infected, and therefore the further spread of infections is very, very limited because of that. And that this herd immunity might be the best route to follow, providing all necessary protocols are in place to protect Aruba's most vulnerable. So we know that there are chances of visitors bringing in the infection. We're going to control it to the best degree that we can. Clearly, we have to understand, and this is the purpose of today, and it's the purpose of all of these kinds of discussions, we have to understand what could and could not happen. Tourism is vital to the future economic health of Aruba and must reopen. We really don't have an option. Many people have said, well, we should diversify the economy. That's not something that we can do in the short term. It is something that can happen in the long term. We have the households, nearly 40,000 households that will be looking for income. 58,000 people working, looking for income, the government looking for income, everybody, businesses. We really don't have an option except to reopen our tourism industry in the best way that we can. But we have to manage the reopening carefully and thoughtfully and think about the long-term implications of reestablishing the sector. It's very important to understand that managing in the age of COVID-19 is going to be with us for quite a number of years. This is not going away. 2021, we will have to have these protocols in place, 22, until such time as an effective vaccine is developed or herd immunity kicks in to control the spread. We have to understand that the level of business in 2020 and into 21 will be nowhere near what it was in 2019, and we have to plan accordingly. But if the sector is to survive in the longer term, and it's imperative that it does, it's 3/4 of our economy, it will have to seriously restructure how it operates, focusing on safety, flexibility, and efficiency. Now, there is a saying, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And the crisis gives Aruba the opportunity to rethink its future. I think for years, Aruba has recognized the need to diversify its economy. It's very difficult, but this crisis reinforces just exactly why this is so necessary. And what the situation we have now allows Aruba the opportunity to rethink its goals and its future, and also particularly to rethink its approach to tourism. And there is a new school of thought been developed over the past few years. Donut economics could well provide the framework for such a discussion. Next slide. Now, donut economics, this is, as you can see, looks like a donut. And basically in the middle, you have the basic needs for safe and just societies. Surrounding those needs as a safe and just environmental space for humanity. And then surrounding the donut itself are what is known as zones of unacceptable environmental dangers. That's a very simplistic explanation of the donut. Next slide. In detail, you can see in the middle is the hole, the donut hole. And basically it's the social foundation, society, the basic needs of society: food, water, income, education, gender equality, jobs. This is what society basically relies on and needs. And these are the sustainable goals that Aruba is committed to. Surrounding this is the safe and just space for humanity based on inclusive and sustainable economic development. So that's the donut that generates all of those, supporting those particular needs. And then you have an environmental ceiling, which is basically the capability of the environment of dealing with these particular needs. And then surrounding that are all of these environmental issues, which are basically impacting our way in which we live: climate change, freshwater use, land use change, biodiversity loss. And the whole idea is to address those and mitigate them to ensure that this safe and just space for humanity is allowed to flourish and provide the food, the water, the income, education, and so on and so forth that society needs. Next slide. Now, Amsterdam is rethinking its whole approach to the future based on this idea of donut economics. They recently produced this Amsterdam circular strategy for the next 5 years, 2020, 2025. And it's amongst the first cities in the world to turn to donut economics. The goals of the plan aren't about growing the economy or increasing the GDP. The goals are much more about making the city a better place for people and the planet. Now, I know that in Amsterdam, you say tourism is about 5% of the economy, but interestingly, it has a more visible presence, if you like. And one of the things that has happened over the past few months is that with the prohibition of entry of international visitors, the residents of Amsterdam have realized that there are some major benefits to having the city without those visitors, and are now looking at this particular plan and how to come up with a strategy which basically allows them to grow their city, but without focusing completely on pure economic growth. Next slide. And similarly with tourism, this is an opportunity to rethink for many nations the kind of tourism that they have. And Jamaica is probably the best example of this at the moment. They've established a task force which goes back to ground zero. What is the baseline for tourism, a clean starting position that really addresses the needs of everybody, the community, business, the visitor, the residents, and develop scenarios for multiple versions of the future, which is the one which is most acceptable to us, a high growth, a low growth, minimum impact on the environment scenarios, and establishes the strategic posture for the sector as well as a broad direction of the journey back to the growth that is felt to be most acceptable. And the plan establishes actions and strategic imperatives that will be reflected across various scenarios. And Jamaica is just one example. New Zealand is another. These are some quotes from the CEO of the New Zealand Tourist Board. He said, while we're in this quiet period, there's a chance to address shortcomings with infrastructure and come up with ways to avoid congestion. New Zealand was beginning to become concerned about the level of congestion at certain places within its communities, particularly Queenstown. Our industry already had a very strong commitment to sustainability, but now there's an opportunity to make it even more sustainable and focus on the needs of the environment and the wider community. We have a chance to think about tourism in the long term. We have to deliver for everyone, but not at the expense of the environment. So my final slide, the coronavirus crisis is a perfect time to reevaluate our economic systems and explore alternatives to a growth-oriented economic policy. Basically, now is the moment to do something different and establish a different type of economy, especially given the next and the biggest crises haven't gone away. Even after this pandemic is brought under control, we're still going to have to address climate change and global ecosystem change. So what I'm saying is that in the short term, clearly the situation is bleak in the sense that the number of visitors, the income, the number of jobs is going to be significantly less than it was. But from a positive perspective, it does give us the opportunity to really think about the direction that we want to go in the future and to take the opportunity provided by this crisis to begin to plan for the Aruba that we want. Thank you.
No, thank you very, very much for that interesting presentation, Jim. You had me at the edge of my chair throughout the entire presentation. I'm sure there's some questions that I see the chat has been busy during the presentation. Our first question says, from the CEO of Boeing and airline companies in the USA, we learned that it is not probable that international flights from the USA will resume the coming months, and it will take 3 to 5 years before the airline industry will recover from this crisis. How do you think we can diversify the hospitality business so we can target the millions of tourists that has come to Aruba in the past and still earning spin-off dollars?
Thanks. Yes. No, that's very true. And that's exactly what I said during the presentation. The International Air Transport Authority is saying essentially the same thing. There will be some travel internationally, but it'll be very limited by comparison with what it was in 2019 and before. And I think one of the encouraging things, as you quite rightly say, is that we have a number of past visitors who have very positive opinions of Aruba. And we're fortunate that we have very capable marketing agencies that work with the ATA that are in constant contact with those past visitors. And I think there are opportunities to be able to talk to them and find out ways in which we can maybe not expect them to come visit directly, but certainly monetize the possibilities of working with them based on their affection for and love for Aruba. It's going to be a challenge, I understand that. But it is encouraging that there is, if you talk to a number of the hotels, you talk to a number of the resorts, particularly the timeshare resorts, there is a strong body of customers that really want to come back to Aruba. Now, as I say, the challenge with that is, firstly, will they feel comfortable with the certification program that we have in place? Will they feel that it meets their concerns about safety? And secondly, what will the protocols be for their return into the United States? And we can control what we do here on the island, but unfortunately those protocols are in the hands of the US government. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. But yes, I agree with you. I mean, we have to really think very strongly about how can we basically build upon the strong core of loyal visitors that we have.
Yeah, thank you for answering that one. Another question we received was, we can open borders, but that does not mean that tourists will come. How can we give confidence to the tourists that it is safe and okay to come to Aruba?
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly why the ATA and the government are putting in this clean certification program, because the first thing that many visitors are going to have is a concern about safety. Are the protocols being put in place? Are those protocols effective? Will the social distancing work? All of those, I think, are going to be very important. And I think what you're going to find is that that's going to be reinforced by the brands. Our hotel brands are going to be doing exactly the same thing because they have the same concerns. The airlines are going to be doing exactly the same thing. Safety is going to be probably the most paramount issue. And if we can demonstrate that we have a clean and safe environment, I think that will be one of the more important things that we can do to encourage visitors to return to Aruba.
Yeah, thanks. I could imagine I see questions coming by asking about receiving the slides of the presentation. At a later date, we hope to make this presentation available via recording and hopefully with the slides. So bear with us, it will be made available at a later moment. Another question we received as well is the opportunity to shift economic paradigm is here if there was ever one more urgent and demanding. What would be the first steps that would have to be taken to begin to explore thinking in terms of both people and environment?
That's a very good question, Deborah. And I do recall that when I first arrived in Aruba in 2009, one of the documents that I was fortunate enough to be given to look at was Nos Aruba, which had been prepared in 2007, 2008. And basically it looked at scenarios for the future of Aruba based on full consultation with stakeholders in the community. And I thought it was an excellent document. And it really did basically provide everybody in the community the opportunity to think through what kind of Aruba do they want. And I think something like that has got to be one of the first things that we really think about, which is getting the whole community involved through stakeholders, all of the stakeholders. It's not going to be a top-down. I think it has to be bottom-up. What kind of Aruba do we want? How is it going to function? What kind of numbers do we want? What kind of economy do we want? And then use that as a starting point to develop a strategy.
Okay, thank you. This is a really interesting one. Is the Aruban government aware of the donut economics? And if so, would it be easy to implement and apply here? Don't know. Maybe you know, Jim?
Well, it's a fairly new idea, but I'm sure that there's obviously an innovation department within the government, and I'm sure they've looked at these new ideas. They're becoming quite popular, as I say. Amsterdam is looking at them, Philadelphia is looking at them, Costa Rica is looking at them. But really, it's all about sustainability. And it's about what kind of Aruba do we want? And I think that's one of the questions that the government has really been beginning to address. I'd like to think that the university has an opportunity to push this forward and basically articulate the idea in the community as we're doing today. This is a great opportunity to put the ideas forward. But I think it's got a lot of merit. And I think you're going to, I'm sure all of us have been questioning in the past this whole focus on just let's grow GDP blindly, let's continue to see economic growth and without fully understanding the consequences. And I think now that there's a much more receptive environment for a discussion such as this, and I'd like to think yes, that it could work in Aruba. I don't see why not.
Yeah. So someone would like to thank you, James, for an interesting presentation. It is indeed more than short-term or recovery. The donut economic model is not new. How is this thriving now for Amsterdam and New Zealand? And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, in Amsterdam, as I say, there is a 5-year plan which has been developed on the basis of the donut economics, and certainly there's more information available. You can go onto YouTube, and there's certain documents that can be made available. The plan itself can be made available, and they're beginning to see that this is being picked up in other communities throughout the world, and New Zealand. They're probably one of the leaders when it comes to thinking about how tourism is going to evolve. I teach a class on destination marketing, and frequently you go back and say, well, this is what they're doing in New Zealand. This is what they're doing in New Zealand. And there is a lot of literature available, a lot of thinking going on about how to evolve moving forward. So yeah, I mean, it's something that can be made available.
Yeah. So everyone is really happy because they keep on thanking you for your presentation. And
Pleasure.
It's really nice. And they said, how do you envision the donut economics to be practically implemented in the Aruban community, and more specifically within the future tourism sector, in order to take the opportunity now after this crisis to rebuild better? So.
Yeah, well, I think to be fair to the IATA, I mean, they've certainly been looking at this concept of what kind of tourism do we want over the past 5-6 years. And one of the things that happened, I'm sure you're all aware, is that when I joined the IATA as a director, we were once known as a destination marketing organization, a DMO. And then that evolved to become a destination marketing and management organization. And, cities such as Amsterdam, Barcelona, Venice, all of them were beginning to question, is pure growth alone what we're really looking for? And management in terms of how can you manage the visitor economy so it benefits the residents, not just economically, but also through in terms the society that we live in, the community. It protects sustainable, it protects our culture, for example. The IATA has been pursuing that kind of thought strategy for some time now. So this is really, it's not unusual, it's not very different, but it gets back to managing the tourism economy, not just marketing for its own sake.
Okay, thank you. Now I see we have two more questions. Someone asked, can you suggest a new word we can use to replace the word tourist? They said, which is associated with exploitation. So given better expression to the new concept of valued visitors to our country.
Well, visitors is one, guests is another. But I mean, one thing that has to be understood is that they're partners as well, in a way. I mean, you're inviting them into your country, and that's what we're doing. We're inviting them. That's what we do in terms of come visit Aruba, come spend your money. I mean, to be blunt, come spend your money in Aruba. We're inviting you as a guest. But it's a two-way street, that you have a responsibility. And again, to be fair to the IATA, this is something that they've begun promoting over the past 12 to 18 months, that they make the visitor makes a commitment to sustainable practices while they're here in Aruba. And I think this idea of partnership is very, very important. So, we're working for the benefits of both. The visitor comes here for a reason. They come here to enjoy the experience, to feel better. But equally, at the end of the day, we're benefiting from their economic contribution. But it has to be done in a sustainable fashion.
Yeah. The last question, I saw someone ask it as well, is there a way to re-educate our community on the importance of tourism and service in all aspects of the world, as every country will be targeting all travelers? This is our last question.
Yeah, no, that's a very good thing. And I'm on the board of directors of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, and this is one of the things we've been talking about over the past 2 months. If anything has led to a better understanding of how important tourism is the fact that it's shut down through April and May. Now people understand how important tourism is. And that's happening right across the Caribbean. And as a result of that, governments are now much more conscious, and the community is much more conscious of the importance of tourism. I don't know that we necessarily have to educate anybody as to how important tourism is. Now they understand it. The question is building on that understanding and understanding the nuances of tourism, understanding that this is a partnership, that it has to be sustainable, that it has to be in the best interest not of just of the guest, but also of the resident as well. And so I think there are tremendous opportunities, as I say, with the ATA being not just a marketing organization but a management organization, that the management of our visitor economy becomes even more critical.
No. Thank you, and thank you very much, Jim, for this presentation. Again, you will see people are thanking you. It was very data-driven, very informative. And I want to thank everyone for logging in and zooming in, as we would say, with us. Tomorrow we'll have another presentation with Aruba Pinas, and we'll be looking then on going from consumption to production post-Corona. I can just thank you again. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and also visit our website, www.ua.aw, to see next week's presentation, but also to stay pending for the month of June, where we'll also have another series of presentations. If you are not a member of our mailing list, please take this opportunity as well to send us an email, and that way we will ensure that you're the first ones to be informed. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a pleasant morning/beginning of the afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everyone.